your father served in the Second World War, or the Korean War, there is a very good chance he carried this thing, or served next to a man who did. He probably called it by its nickname, named after a musical instrument that a boy in Arkansas had made out of 2 lengths of gas pipe, around 1905. He probably did not know that the man who designed it, the 23-year-old lieutenant, who had walked past a scrap heap on an army post in Maryland in May of 1942 and bent down to pick up a piece of steel nobody wanted, he probably did not know that the shaped charge inside its warhead had been invented in the 1880s by an American physicist nobody remembered, and then rejected by 3 governments in a row. Before it found its way onto that soldier's shoulder, probably did not know that 6 years later, in Korea, the same weapon would fail his younger brothers, because somebody in Washington had stopped paying attention. This is the whole story of the bazooka from the pipe, the village in the snow, to the road out of Chosin, begins at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. May 1942. Tank is rolling across a firing range, not a real one. Target Hulk, painted, moving on tracks. 5 weapons are trying to hit it. Big AWP mortars, stubby, awkward. At this moment they represent the most promising idea the United States Army has for throwing an armor-piercing charge at a moving target. There is a program behind them. There is a schedule. Somebody has drawn up a list of 5 competing designs, and senior officers have driven out to the range to watch the list perform. Standing at one end of the firing line is a 6th thing that is not on the list. It is a length of steel pipe, 5 feet long, open at both ends. A wooden stock has been bolted underneath. Its sights were made that morning out of a wire coat hanger, bent into shape with a broken nail somebody picked up off the ground. 2 men have brought it. Neither of them was invited. The mortars fire. Not one of them touches the tank. Pipe hits it, then hits it again. Now, here is what makes that morning genuinely strange, and it has almost nothing to do with luck. Both of the hard problems inside that pipe had already been solved by other people in other countries years earlier. America already owned a warhead that could open any tank on Earth the way a church key opens a beer can. America already owned a rocket motor that fired with no recoil whatsoever. Both were sitting in Ordnance Department storage. Both were useless. The warhead was too heavy to throw and too heavy to launch. The rocket had nowhere on a human body to sit, so what changed? Not a discovery. Nothing was invented that spring. What changed was a measurement, one number checked once by a lieutenant in his early 20s who happened to be walking past a junk pile, and who happened to be one of only 2 people in the entire United States Army who held both halves of the problem in his head at the same time. That number had a date. It had a burn time you can look up in a technical manual, and it carried a price paid 6 months later on a North African beach by men who opened the crates and did not know what they were looking at. To understand how that pipe got to Aberdeen, we have to go back 18 months, to a room in Washington, and a young Swiss engineer asking the American government for $25,000. Nobody wanted to pay it. His name was Henry Mohaupt. He was 23 years old. He was not American, and he was carrying the single most valuable idea in infantry warfare. The time the American tests were finally run at Aberdeen in late 1940, Mohaupt had already been turned away twice. First time was September 1938. He walked into the War Technology Department of the Swiss Army and set up a demonstration. No patent had been granted yet, so he was not permitted to explain how his device worked. He could only show them what it did. The Swiss watched and declined. Their reasoning was perfectly respectable and completely wrong. Everyone knew that killing a tank required kinetic energy, which meant a heavy shell moving very fast out of a rifled barrel. Mohaupt's thing did not move fast, therefore it could not work. Therefore what they had just watched had not happened. The British were next. In the spring of 1939, Mohaupt set up a demonstration in Zurich for representatives of the Royal Arsenal. This time, the observers understood exactly what they were seeing, and that was the problem. They suspected the effect behind it was one their own scientists had already documented decades earlier, which made the license fee Mohaupt was asking look outrageous. Negotiations ended, the British went home, and then they did something the story is often too polite to mention. Guessing correctly at the principle Mohaupt was hiding, they went off and built their own version of it. They called it the number 68 rifle grenade. It defeated around 52 millimeters of armor, and it has a decent claim to being the first true shaped charge munition to enter service anywhere in the world. Two governments had now looked directly at the answer and walked past it. Surely. 3. Years before any of this, an American inventor named Neville Hopkins had brought a shaped charge munition to the United States Ordnance Department. The Ordnance Department had said no to that, too. Which brings us to the strangest part. What Mohaupt actually had was 60 years old. Back in the 1880s, an American physicist named Charles Munro had noticed something odd about explosives. If you hollow out a cone in the front face of a charge, the blast does not spread outward. It focuses. All of that energy, instead of pushing in every direction at once, gets funneled into a single point. Line the cone with metal, and the effect becomes something else entirely. The liner collapses inward at detonation and squirts forward as a jet of metal, moving at kilometers per second. This is worth pausing on, because almost everyone imagines it wrong. A hollow charge does not burn through armor, it does not melt it. Punches a needle of metal through the plate that the steel cannot respond to. The armor behaves, briefly, like a liquid. An American field manual from 1944 described the result with the flatness of a maintenance report. A hole about an inch across, and fragments of the tank's own armor, heated to incandescence, blown into the crew compartment in a cone of roughly 90 degrees. Any ammunition sitting inside that cone would usually go off. An inch-wide hole, that was all it took, not because the hole was big, because of what came through it, and the Germans got there first. Not on paper, in combat. On the morning of May 10th, 1940, while Mohaupt was still being politely shown the door across Europe, German engineers landed on the roof of the Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael and used shaped charges of their own design to crack a position that was supposed to be uncrackable. The assault is worth looking at up close, because it is the morning the shaped charge left the laboratory and walked into a war. 9 gliders, 78 men, under an officer named Rudolf Witzig, cut loose from their tow planes in the dark and landed silently on the roof of the largest fortress in Europe. Eben-Emael was supposed to be impregnable. 1,200 Belgian soldiers inside, steel and concrete gun cupolas thick enough to laugh at any conventional bomb. The Germans on the roof carried a new kind of thing, in 2 sizes, 12.5 kilograms, 50 kilograms, in what looked like an oversized dumbbell. They walked up to the cupolas, set the charges, and backed away. The cupolas came apart from the inside. By breakfast, the largest fortress in Europe was a ruin, held by a handful of German paratroopers, waiting for the main body to arrive. 6 of them had died doing it. 1,200 Belgians surrendered. That is what the shaped charge does. Somebody in your army has decided to build one, while the men across the border are still arguing about whether it exists. A separate line of German research, running independently of Mohaupt's, had beaten every Allied nation to the battlefield. Then France fell, and the situation changed. Before the collapse, Mohaupt had been working in Paris, the French armaments house of Edgar Brandt. The French government now authorized the release of his information to the United States. He arrived in Washington with drawings, including one for a 60mm warhead. Tests followed at Aberdeen in late 1940. The Army recommended acquiring the rights. The Navy did too. By 1941, America had it, the M10 anti-tank grenade, Mohaupt's warhead inside, 3.5 pounds. It would defeat roughly 60 millimeters of armor plate, enough to kill any German tank then in service, from any angle. Strength of that single figure, the United States now possessed the best infantry anti-armor device in the Allied world. And here is the sentence that governs everything that follows. There was no way to deliver it. Consider the arithmetic. A hand grenade weighs about 1.5 pounds. A fit man can throw one perhaps 30 or 40 yards. The M10 weighed more than twice that, and it had to arrive nose first to work at all. Shaped charge that lands sideways is just a loud noise. So hand throwing was out. Fire it from a rifle then. The Army tried. To launch 3.5 pounds of steel and explosive to any useful distance from the muzzle of a Springfield or a Garand, you need a blank cartridge with a truly ferocious charge behind it. The recoil that came back wrecked rifles. It also wrecked shoulders. Every account of this period uses some version of the same phrase. The launching device was damaged even when it was resting on the ground. So ordnance did the only thing left. They made the warhead worse. The M9 grenade was a smaller, weaker relative of the M10, cut down until a rifle could actually throw it, and a whole family of launching adapters grew up around it. One for the Springfield, one for the Enfield, one for the Garand, one for the carbine. It was a reasonable engineering compromise, and it meant that the American infantryman's anti-tank grenade was deliberately less capable than the warhead sitting in the same arsenal, the M10 itself. The good one. The official method of employment was this. An infantryman walks up to the tank and places it on the tank. Read that again. 1941, the recommended technique for using the best anti-armor warhead in the Western world was for a man to leave his hole, cross open ground, reach an armored vehicle that was actively trying to kill him, and set the charge against its hull with his hands. Nobody was pretending this was a good idea. The Army's own histories described it, without much softening, as an unlikely means of delivery in most combat situations. It was a doctrine of last resort dressed up as a doctrine. And it existed because the men writing it had run out of options. There is a bitter footnote to Mohaupt's part in this. He came to the United States, and he stayed. He worked in Washington eventually for the Navy, but he remained a Swiss citizen, and by one well-documented account, that citizenship blocked him from the security clearance he would have needed to work on classified American ordnance. The man who held the Allied patents on shaped charges. The man who in 1940 was arguably the leading expert in the Allied world on the subject. He spent the war on the outside of the weapons category he had helped create, brought the payload. Someone else would have to find the ride, which is the strange part, because the ride already existed. It had existed since 1918, and for most of the years in between it had been kept alive by exactly one man, working in his own basement, with his own money. Aberdeen Proving Ground, November 6, 1918. A photographer takes a picture of two men and an odd contraption. The handwritten note on the print calls it a 1-inch recoilless gun. One of the two is Robert Goddard, later called the father of modern rocketry, at that moment doing war work on contract. Beside him is Clarence Hickman, a young physics PhD out of Clark University. What they are showing Ordnance Department representatives is a tube, open at both ends, with no recoil at all. One report from that obscure trial suggested such weapons could be developed to work against tanks. 5 days later, in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, Germany signed the armistice. That is the whole story of the first American shoulder-fired rocket. Demonstration of favourable note in a file, and then a war that ended before anyone had a reason to care. Goddard fell seriously ill with tuberculosis. He stayed on as a part-time government consultant until 1923, then turned toward the thing he actually wanted, which was space. Hickman went into industry, and, among other achievements, became known as the father of scientific archery. Tube went into a drawer. There it stayed for 22 years. For a reason that is easy to miss, it had not failed. Shelved, because there was nothing worth putting inside it. A rocket that delivers a small charge of ordinary high explosive against armor plate is functionally a firework. Until the shaped charge arrived, the launcher was an answer to a question nobody had asked. Enter the man who refused to let it go. Leslie Alfred Skinner was born in San Francisco, April 21st, 1900, the only son of an army surgeon. The rockets started early. They also stopped early, at least officially. In 1915, at Fort Strong in Massachusetts, one of his experiments set the hospital roof on fire, after which the activity was forbidden. Think about that boy, 15 years old, on a military post, and he sets the hospital alight with something he built himself. 27 years later, he would put a rocket on the shoulder of the United States Army. The Boston Latin School and brief wartime service, he began medical training at Harvard. following his father into surgery. Then he changed his mind to West Point instead. Graduated in 1924, commissioned into the Air Corps, qualified as an airship pilot and air observer. In 1932, an attachment took him to Aberdeen, where he began experimenting with solid propellant rockets, where the official record notes something remarkable in passing. At that moment, his work was the only rocket research in the entire United States Armed Forces. A master's degree at MIT followed, then a return to Aberdeen as an instructor, and more experiments. On his own time, materials came from wherever he could find them. Discarded artillery propellant, scrap parts, whatever the proving ground threw out that week. Funding came out of his own pocket. In 1933, the Army formalized the arrangement by creating a one-man rocket unit and assigning him to it. The Army's official history of wartime munitions planning described his situation in two clauses that ought to be carved somewhere: limited funds and the indifference of his fellow officers. Sit with the image. The rocket program of the United States of America in the middle of the 1930s is one captain. Fits in a basement. Among the things he built was a tube-launched recoilless missile 18 inches long and an inch across. His launching platform was a music rack, a metal music stand, kind you find in a school band room. Hold on to that detail. It comes back later, in a way nobody could have scripted. In 1938, the Army sent him to Hawaii for 2 years. Tells you exactly how much value it placed on all of this. Then Poland was overrun, then France, and rocket weapons stopped being eccentric. Turn in 1940, he went to the rocket laboratory at Indian Head, Maryland, under the direction of Clarence Hickman. The same Hickman from 1918, 22 years of institutional forgetting, bridged by 2 individual memories. In December 1940, Skinner produced sketches of a tube-launched anti-tank rocket. He was told there was no warhead worth firing from it. Look at the shape of that, inside one ordnance department. At the same time, 2 things existed: a warhead with no delivery system, and a delivery system with no warhead. Same organization, same paperwork, never introduced. In June of 1941, the rocket program doubled in size. It went from 1 man to 2. The new arrival was Lieutenant Edward Uhl, born March 24th, 1918, in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Son of a mechanic and a homemaker, Jefferson High School, class of 1936. An engineering physics degree from Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Phi Beta Kappa, into the Army in 1941, commissioned into ordnance. He came with a solid grounding in physics and mechanics. And he came, by every account, energetic, a polite way of describing a young engineer just handed half of a national research effort. 23 years old, the pair went to work. The Navy's jet propulsion specialists, with the National Defense Research Committee, laboratories. Hardware was crude and mostly homemade. Skinner was still building experimental motors in his basement. Several launching arrangements got tried. One used the long bayonet of a Springfield rifle as a rail. Either brilliant or desperate. Probably both. The introduction, when it finally came, the introduction between the warhead and the rocket was not made by a general. It was not made by a scientist. It was made by a lawyer. Colonel Gregory J. Kessenich ran the patent section of the Ordnance Department, the job consisting largely of reading other people's paperwork. He had been following the M10 grenade program closely. Somewhere in that reading he had the thought nobody assigned to either project managed to have. The M10's warhead on a rocket, and both problems vanish at once. The rocket removes the recoil. The warhead gives the rocket something worth carrying. Took it to Colonel Wiley T. Moore, head engineer of Ordnance's Small Arms Division. Moore was persuaded and handed the work to Skinner. There is something almost comic about where the great American infantry weapon of the Second World War got started. Not a war game. A patent office. By a man whose job was noticing what other people had written down. So by the spring of 1942, Uhl had a rocket motor that worked. and a warhead that worked, and 2 questions that had never been formally assigned to anyone in the United States Army. How does a man aim this, and how does he avoid being set on fire? He was going to answer both of them, at once, on foot, without stopping. And the object that let him do it was already lying in the dirt, 20 feet from where he was standing. Somewhere on the grounds at Aberdeen, spring of 1942, there was a pile of discarded metal. Every large military installation has one. You have probably walked past 100 of them in your life. Behind a motor pool, behind a machine shop, the place things go when they have finished being useful and nobody has yet decided what to call them. Lying in this one was a length of steel pipe, 5 feet long, 60 millimeters across on the inside, which is to say, same bore as the grenade he and Skinner were busy converting into a rocket. Near enough to matter. Edward Uhl told the story for the rest of his life, and it always ended the same way. He looked at it. He thought, "That's the answer. Put it on a soldier's shoulder with a rocket inside." And away it goes. Now, a note on honesty, because you have been lied to by history books before, and you deserve better than that here. The historian who did the most to popularize that account added a careful caveat, and he was right to. A Eureka story polished by 60 years of retelling has probably lost some of its rough edges. The thought really arrived that cleanly. Whether it was one moment or a dozen, nobody can say. Uhl was the only witness to his own head. The pipe was real. And what it did was not one thing. 4 things at once, and the 4th is the one almost nobody mentions. First, it moved the exhaust. Instead of a flame front expanding outward beside a man's base, everything went straight back down a channel. Behind him. Second, it guided. A rocket leaving an open rail goes roughly where it likes. A rocket leaving 5 feet of enclosed steel goes where the steel was pointed. Third, it gave you a mounting surface. You cannot bolt a sight onto empty air. Fourth, length. The rocket motor burned for about 1/50th of a second. That is not a figure of speech. That is the design specification. 50th of a second, accelerating from rest. The rocket travels a specific and calculable distance. Distance is roughly 54 inches, which means cut it to 54 inches and the fire is finished. Before the projectile clears the muzzle, not shielded, not deflected, finished. Over. By the time the rocket leaves the front of the tube, the burning has already stopped. The man behind it is holding a length of warm steel, instead of standing in a blowtorch. It was not the pipe that solved the problem. It was the fact that somebody measured it against the fire, because any 5-foot length of the same bore would have worked. Thousands were lying in scrap heaps across America that week. What made this one an answer was that the person looking at it already knew how long the flame lasted, and he knew that because he and Skinner had been building the motors themselves in a basement for a year. Think about what the object actually is then. It is not armor. It stops nothing. It is not a barrel. A barrel contains pressure. And this thing was open at both ends and contained nothing whatsoever. What it is, if you want a metaphor that fits, is a clock made of plumbing. Measures out the precise interval during which the rocket is lethal to its owner. And it ends. At the exact moment that interval ends. The rest happened fast. Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia built a launcher designated T1 from Skinner's sketches and Uhl's rough article. 54 inches of slim steel, its length dictated by the ignition to burnout time of the experimental rockets. A wooden stock underneath, an electrical trigger grip. Inside the stock, 2 batteries side by side, one holding the live cell, one holding a spare, and on the side of the stock, small flashlight bulb, recessed into a bowl, so the gunner could confirm the firing circuit was alive, before he needed it to be. 13 pounds all in, 2 men to work it. One drops the rocket in the back end and hooks up a wire trailing from the tail. The other aims and pulls a trigger that sends current down to the igniter. The first live firing took place at a National Defense Research Committee test ground. One single day, before the demonstration at Aberdeen, Uhl fired it from his own shoulder, and he did it wearing a welding helmet, because premature detonations had been seen in earlier rocket testing. Horrible injury was a genuine possibility. One account described his appearance that day as something out of a science fiction serial. from Mars. He was dressed for a fire that did not come. There was so little exhaust that the protective gear turned out to be unnecessary. Measurement had already done the work. Before he touched the trigger, Aberdeen, the following morning, and one final problem. The launcher had no sights, so Uhl improvised, using a wire coat hanger and a piece of nail he found on the ground. You know how that went. 5 Spieger mortars, 5 misses, repeated hits on a moving tank. From the thing with the coat hanger on it, the ranking officer present was Major General Glazian M. Barnes, Chief of Research and Engineering for the Ordnance Department. Barnes was delighted, took the launcher himself, and hit the tank on his first attempt. Before long, the visiting officers had shot off every round available. Someone, a colonel whose name Skinner never recorded in his own written account, looked at this 5 feet of plumbing with a wooden stock on it, and said, "It looks like Bob Burns's bazooka." Which brings us to the strangest coincidence in this entire story. Around 1905, in the back of Heyman's plumbing shop in Van Buren, Arkansas, a boy named Robin Burns picked up a length of gas pipe and blew into it. The sound was later described by more than one person as a wounded moose. He liked it. He built the noise into an instrument. 2 interconnecting pipes that slid against each other like a trombone. A whiskey funnel for a bell. A mouthpiece at the other end. He called it a bazooka, copyrighted the word in 1920, and grew up to be Bob Burns, one of the most recognizable voices on American radio in the 1930s. If you are of a certain age, sitting in a certain kind of living room, on certain Sunday evenings you heard him. He was on the Kraft Music Hall with Bing Crosby. He was on his own show. His voice was in your father's kitchen. Part of his stage act was destroying the instrument at the end of the performance, which is why almost none of the originals survive. 40 years apart, 2 Americans picked up a piece of plumbing pipe and made something nobody had asked them for. One of them was a boy and wanted a joke. One of them was in his early 20s and wanted a way to stop a tank, and the joke gave the weapon its name. There is a photograph, arranged by the Army in 1943, of Burns standing beside an officer holding a production launcher. 2 pipes side by side. One of them plays music badly. The other one kills armor. A few days after Aberdeen came the real test. Formal demonstration at Camp Sims in the District of Columbia. This time the audience was senior officials of the War Department, of the Navy Department, representatives of Allied governments, and the National Defense Research Committee, and this time they used live warheads against a medium tank. The room emptied into a scramble. British observers opened negotiations for samples. But Russian staff officers present at the trial asked to be supplied immediately, despite the fact that development was visibly still in progress. And General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, issued verbal orders, verbal, not written, that 5,000 launchers, 25,000 anti-tank rockets, and 5,000 practice rockets procured. On May 19th, 1942, the contract went to General Electric. E.G. Budd would build the rockets. Philco's metal stamping division would make the components. General Electric was given 30 days to prototype, tool up, test and deliver the entire initial order. They made it. The first batch was ready on June 24th. Full order was completed, with 89 minutes to spare. 89 minutes. Somebody, somewhere, in that plant, was watching a clock. The weapon was standardized on paper as the 2.36-inch rocket launcher M1. On June 14th, 1942, the first physical batch came off the assembly line 10 days later. General Electric's follow-on contracts would eventually run past 450,000 units, from a junk pile to a signed federal contract in something under 2 months. So triumph. The fastest development to production cycle in American ordnance history, near enough. A weapon that cost nothing to invent, weighed 13 pounds, and gave a single infantryman the firepower that had previously required artillery. Except, look closely at those 30 days and ask what was inside them. Prototyping, tooling, testing, manufacturing, packing, shipping. Nobody wrote a training program, nobody built a school. There was no doctrine, no manual worth the name, not one qualified instructor. Crates were already going onto ships, and someone had put instruction sheets inside them, because that was the training program. September 1942. Ship docks at Suez with secret cargo, 600 of the new launchers. First anyone in that theatre had seen. They travelled under a code name, not the joke the troops would settle on. Officially, they were the Whip. The British had a look. They set one up against the frontal armour of a captured Panzer III. It went straight through, then they declined to use it. And they were not being stupid. A weapon whose gunner must close inside 150 yards is useless. You can see for 10 miles. The western desert offered no concealment. A man crawling toward a German tank across open sand would be dead, long before he was in range, so the 600 sat. Then came November 8th, 1942, Operation Torch, and the American landings in North Africa. On the night before the troops went ashore, Lieutenant General Dwight Eisenhower learned from a subordinate that not one soldier in his command had received any instruction whatsoever in the new weapon. Read that again. Not one man. The historian Rick Atkinson described the cargo as the men found it. Crates of peculiar 54-inch open tubes and 3-pound projectiles, shipped with printed instructions, because almost nobody in the force had ever heard of the thing. Followed was not a debut. It was a shambles. The M6 rocket, the ammunition, not the launcher, proved notoriously unreliable. Its battery firing circuit was fragile and got wrecked by rough handling, which is to say, by being carried around. Motors failed in heat, in damp, in salt air. The rockets had sharply pointed noses, which sounds right and was exactly wrong, at a shallow impact angle. Point skates off sloped armour instead of biting in. Longfors bent in transit. During 1943, reports reached Ogden Arsenal and elsewhere of rockets sticking inside the launch tube, sometimes detonating before they cleared it. Aberdeen tried collars and wire wrapping to reinforce the thin sheet metal. Continued until somebody built bore gauges to verify each rocket would run clear before the verdict came in. There had been one morning that suggested otherwise. March 23rd, 1943, El Guettar, 6 weeks after Kasserine. 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, dug in on the ridges east of the town. Patton in command of the corps, sent there to restore something the earlier defeat had broken. At dawn, the German 10th Panzer Division came at them. 50 serviceable tanks, half-tracks behind, Stukas overhead, 6,000 men in the wave, somewhere in a foxhole on one of those ridges. Gunner, with a launcher he had spent 45 minutes learning to use, fired his rocket into the flank of a passing panzer. By the end of the morning, the German assault had come apart. Roughly 30 vehicles destroyed, broken in a minefield, down by the tank destroyers of the 601st Battalion, hit by artillery, hit by the launchers. How many of them by the launchers specifically? Nobody could quite say. The claims and the counterclaims did not line up, which is why the general who came looking for evidence later that year could not find any. The truth was somewhere in between. The bazooka had been at El Guettar, probably killed something. Nobody was quite sure what. That is what a new weapon looks like in its first real fight. Not the neat story of the training film, but confused men, confused terrain, firing at things they could not always identify, and later, remembering something a little cleaner than what happened. And the verdict from the field was the worst thing that could have happened. An American general toured the Tunisian front in 1943, after operations closed, looking for evidence. He could not find one soldier who would tell him the weapon had stopped a tank. Not one. In May of 1943, further issue was suspended. 10 months after Marshall ordered 5,000 of them on the spot, the army stopped handing them out. This is the part that gets edited out of the celebration, and it is the part that matters most. The weapon was not born good, it was born fast. Those are different things. And in the spring of 1943, the difference nearly killed the program. Soviets reached the same conclusion, independently. Around 3,000 launchers and 8,500 rockets went east under Lend-Lease. Soviet testing was unsparing. Penetration measured 50 to 55 millimeters, roughly a third below the American specification. Accuracy fell apart past 50 meters. Flame and smoke gave away the gunner instantly. The propellant burned unevenly in cold weather, which in that theatre was not a footnote. Further deliveries were declined. They kept their 14.5mm anti-tank rifles, which were heavier, longer, and penetrated less. They were not wrong about the weapon they tested. They were wrong about what it would become, and they had no way of knowing that. Neither did anyone else in the spring of 1943. Now the camera turns around, because while American officers read disappointing reports, German soldiers were picking these things up off the ground. It came from Soviet units in late 1942, some from inexperienced American units in Tunisia in early 1943. Which came first has never been settled. German ordnance now held working examples, big enough that captured launchers got a catalogue designation of their own. 6cm Raketenpanzerbuchs 788A. That is the sound of an army filing a foreign weapon into its own supply system. Paperwork equivalent of a compliment. Then their engineers did something the Americans should have found alarming. Germany already owned an excellent 88mm shaped charge rocket, Pupchen, on a wheeled carriage like a small artillery piece. Real punch, decent range, and useless for the thing the American design did. One man, on foot, going where the guns could not. So they married the captured concept to their own warhead. 88mm bore stayed, so the warhead needed no redesign. The motor housing stretched from 490mm, 650, to fit a longer motor. Percussion firing gave way to electrical ignition, copying the Americans. Then going further, to a magneto squeezed by the trigger, which is precisely the change American ordnance would later make itself. The German report dated September 9th, 1943, stated the new weapon would reach Eastern Front troops soon. November 1943. The name entered official documents. Panzerschreck, Tank Terror. Same season the Sturmgewehr got its name, in an army that had decided its weapons should sound like threats. The numbers were brutal. The Pupchen defeated 64mm of armor at 100 meters. The new shoulder launcher defeated 160. The same range. Cost to build 70 Reichsmarks. Total production 314,895. Which brings us to the irony that explains this story better than any statistic. The Germans copied the pipe, they did not copy the measurement. The bigger motor burns longer. The rocket was still burning, roughly 2 meters past the muzzle, in open air, behind the man's shoulder, so they bolted on a blast shield with the rear sight built into it. The manual told the gunner to wear heavy gloves, active poncho, and a gas mask, with the filter removed. Read that list again. A gas mask to fire your own weapon. Finished article ran 164 centimeters, weighed over 20 pounds with the shield, and threw up smoke that advertised the firing position to everyone within a mile. Its crews called it the Ofenrohr, the stovepipe. German engineering understood the American design as a shield. It was a shield, but only because it was the correct length. Stretch the fire longer than the steel, and no amount of added plate gives back what you have lost. They built something that penetrated nearly 3 times as much armor, and was measurably less of a shoulder weapon. Their gunner had to dress like an industrial welder to use it. Meanwhile, the fixing began on the American side. Sequence that saved the program. July 1943, the M1A1. Forward grip deleted, electrical system improved. Older launchers reworked to the new standard through July and August. The improved M6A1 rocket alongside it. October 1943, M6A3. That bit into sloped armor instead of glancing off. Short circular tail fin. That did not bend in a supply truck. M9, with a proper aperture sight. Battery ignition replaced by a trigger-operated magneto. Safety, so releasing the trigger could not fire the rocket. June 1944, the M9A1 splitting in half so a paratrooper could jump with it. September 1944, a Polaroid optical sight with an etched reticle, placing a folding one that broke. 14 months of incremental, deeply boring engineering. Nobody got a medal for the tail fin. Somebody did get a nickname though, hanging them off an airplane. Charles Carpenter was a school teacher from Moline, Illinois, 30 years old when he enlisted in 1942. He had taught history in a high school. Turns out to be relevant. In France in 1944, he was assigned to Patton's Third Army as an artillery spotter, flying an unarmed Piper L4 Grasshopper, basically a civilian Cub in olive drab paint, 2 seats, no radio, a cruising speed of about 70 miles an hour. His job was to circle over the front and call in coordinates. That was his job. It was not what he did. He bolted 6 bazookas to the wing struts of his airplane, 3 on each side, painted Rosie the Rocketer on the fuselage, in a nod to the women in the factories back home, and he went hunting tanks. He would dive to about 100 meters, point the nose of the Cub at the top of a German turret, fire, bank hard, come around again. September 20th, 1944, the Battle of Araucourt, eastern France. Carpenter took off in fog and could not see the ground. Around noon it cleared. He spotted a company of Panthers pressing toward the American lines. He emptied his tubes, landed, reloaded, went back up. Flew 2 more sorties that afternoon. By the end of October he had been credited with at least 5 German armoured vehicles. That made him a tank ace, in an airplane that was not supposed to be armed at all. The Germans stopped ignoring the little planes over their lines. Carpenter said as much in a letter home. Word was getting around, he wrote. Every time he showed up now, they shot with everything they had. A high school history teacher, in a hobby airplane, 6 lengths of pipe from a Maryland scrap heap, killing German armour over eastern France. They called him Bazooka Charlie. And the Mad Major, he survived the war, went back to teaching, died in 1966. Rosie the Rocketer, his airplane, is being restored in a garage in Oregon. People who have never met him, who felt he was worth remembering anyway. And in October 1944, having read the field complaints and examined captured German launchers, Ordnance began developing a 3.5-inch replacement. Decision will matter enormously 5 years from now to men who have never heard of any of these people, and who are not yet aware they will be sent to a place called Osan. One last item, the most honest assessment in the record. Late in the war, Corporal Donald E. Lewis took part in an armor penetration test against a Panther tank, firing both the captured German launcher and an American M9. He reported to his superiors that the German weapon was far superior, and added he had been impressed enough to be ready to go after the Germans with their own equipment. Corporal, telling the United States Army that the enemy's copy beat the original, went in the file. And somebody read it. If your father or your uncle or your grandfather carried one of these, or served in a unit that did, in Tunisia, Italy, the Ardennes, the Pacific, would be grateful to read about it in the comments below. Unit, and where? What did he actually say about the thing? Kitchen tables, when someone asked. The men who opened those first crates in North Africa, printed sheet for a teacher, are almost all gone now. And what they said, over coffee, on Sunday mornings, half a century ago, is in no archive, because by the 3rd week of December 1944, all that patient fixing was finished. The sights worked, the fuses worked, the fins did not bend, and in 2 Belgian villages, snow, the thing finally got the only examination that ever counted. Prinkelt and Rocherath are 2 Belgian villages, sitting so close together the locals call them the twins. December 17th and 18th, 1944, the 2nd and 3rd days of Hitler's last offensive. They held the northern shoulder of the Bulge, and outside them, crossroads called Lausdell, American infantry stood in the snow, and waited for the 12th SS Panzer Division. Boys, most of them, Hitlerjugend, fanatical, well-equipped, coming down through the fog with Panthers. Those 2 days were not one-weapon story. Shermans fought there. and M10 tank destroyers and artillery and mines, and men with rifles, holding ground they had no business holding. But when the counting was done, by some accounts, 21 German armoured vehicles, knocked out by infantry rocket teams, another 27, guns and mines, enough between them to wreck an SS Panzer Corps schedule and force a change of plan. 21 vehicles, foot, in the snow, 20 months. After a general walked the Tunisian front asking whether this thing had ever stopped a tank, and went home with nothing. Now the honest part, which the celebration always skips. Across the Northwest Europe campaign, American troops fired, by most estimates, more than 1 million of these rockets. That is not the profile of a weapon kept in reserve for special occasions. It is the profile of one that men reached for constantly, against bunkers, pill houses, machine gun positions, anything needing a hole in it, against tanks specifically. The arithmetic is sobering. On paper, the effective range ran to 300 yards, the average range at which an American soldier successfully engaged an enemy tank was 55 yards. In a letter dated May 20th, 1944, George Patton put it lower still, telling a colleague the weapon was not for hunting tanks at all, that its purpose was keeping armour off infantry as a last resort, and that the range ought therefore to be held to around 30 yards. 30 yards. Pace it out on a street sometime. That is closer than home plate to the pitcher's mound, close enough to read the writing on the hull, close enough that the tank commander, hatch open, can see the shape of you, and that was Europe. There were tanks to shoot at, half a world away, starting much earlier. The weapon was doing something else entirely. Guadalcanal in 1942, Tarawa in 1943. The Pacific War had been finding its own uses for the tube from the very beginning. On the islands of the Pacific, the Japanese had almost no armour worth mentioning. Their tanks were thin-skinned, undergunned, rare on the battlefield. They had instead was concrete and volcanic rock, and a defensive doctrine that turned every coral atoll into a honeycomb of shooting positions. At Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, American infantry landed against pillboxes, bunkers, tunnel complexes cut through rock so hard it turned naval fire into gravel. The bazooka came ashore, in an army fighting a different war than it had planned for. It turned out to be very good at putting a hole in a bunker. The tactic was called blowtorch and corkscrew, grenades, submachine gun, a flamethrower, and a bazooka team standing behind them. One rocket into the gun port, from 30 yards, would collapse the inside of a firing position that had shrugged off battleship shells for 3 days. On Iwo Jima, the Japanese had dug 11 miles of tunnels, 30 tanks buried to their turrets in volcanic ash, turned into steel pillboxes, 300 separate fortifications on an island 8 square miles wide. The place was engineered for one purpose, to kill Americans slowly. Marines with bazookas went through it room by room, not to destroy an armoured formation, to destroy a doorway, and what was on the other side. Several of the men who would receive the Medal of Honor for actions involving this weapon earned it on those islands, on ground where a man never saw a tank, but used the same tube, the same rocket, to end the same problem. A different way. The engineers at Aberdeen had not designed it for any of that. Then, they had not designed it for anything in particular, except a rocket motor and a Swiss engineer's warhead, a certain interval of fire. Every other use it found was found by the men carrying it. What that did to the life expectancy of the man holding it is exactly what you would expect. The geometry required him to move toward the thing trying to kill him, until he was near enough to be sure. In total, at least 15 Americans would receive the Medal of Honor. Actions involving this weapon, 11 of them in Europe, 3 of those 11 in the Ardennes. One of them was a boy from Berlin. Isidor Siegfried Jackman was born in Berlin on December 14th, 1922, first son of Leo and Lotte Jackman. The family emigrated when he was 2. He grew up on Primrose Avenue in Baltimore, where his father ran a newspaper route for the Sun papers. Baltimore City College, finished 1939, then a year of physical education at the University of Baltimore. Friends called him Izzy. He was Jewish, and 6 of his aunts and uncles died in the Holocaust. 6, not distant relatives read about in the newspaper. His father's brothers, his mother's sisters, the people who had held him before America. He enlisted in November 1942, a month before his 20th birthday. On January 4th, 1945, Staff Sergeant Jackman was with Company B, 513th Parachute Infantry, 17th Airborne, Flamiège. In Belgium, his company lay pinned under artillery, mortar. 2 German tanks moved in and began inflicting casualties. Machine gun fire had already knocked out the company's rocket teams. Yashman left cover. He ran across open ground, reached a man who had fallen, took the launcher from him, and advanced on the tanks, both of which turned their guns on him. Firing alone, he damaged one and drove both off. The German attack came apart. He was hit doing it. He died. He was 22. Years later, Flamiège put up a statue. An American soldier had stood and fought for the village. They did not know who he was. A search of army records established it was Jachman, and his name went on the stone. Sit with the shape of that. A boy born in Berlin, whose family fled, whose relatives were being murdered in the country of his birth, walking with a length of steel that an American engineer had pulled from a scrap pile on a Maryland army post, a Belgian village, raising a monument to a man whose name they had to look up. His family in Baltimore got a telegram in January and a Medal of Honor in June of 1950. After the war, Dwight Eisenhower named 4 tools as the ones that won it. The Allies: the atomic bomb, the Jeep, the C-47 transport. This, the Army's own post-war assessment, gave it a distinction no other American design earned. The one genuinely new weapon that reached the fighting early enough to be used everywhere. 3 items on that list were vast industrial undertakings. One started as garbage. The final scale was absurd. 476,628 launchers of all models. 15,603,000 rockets. The French forces took some 11,350. Brazil 2,876. China 2018, Canada 177. More reached the French Maquis and Yugoslav partisans, fighting in forests, with a design a plumber's offcut had made possible, and then the fixing stopped. After 1945, budget cuts pushed by Secretary of Defense Louis A. Johnson effectively cancelled general issue of the 3.5-inch launcher that Ordnance had begun designing in October of 1944. It existed. It worked. It was not distributed, so the unit sent to Korea in the summer of 1950 carried the 2.36-inch launcher and warehouse stocks of wartime rockets that had sat in storage for 5 years. July 5, 1950. A hill above the road between Osen and Suwon, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Brad Smith, 34 years old, with roughly 540 men, 2 of his 4 rifle companies, still at sea. Rain that morning, cold, the kind that soaks through wool. 8:16, the first American artillery round of the Korean War went out. 33 T-34-85 tanks kept coming. A gunner in the roadside ditch. Second Lieutenant Ollie Connor, 22 rockets into the rear of those tanks. Plate is thinnest, from about 15 yards. 15 yards. The Army's official history records the result in words. Worth reading slowly. Whether they had any effect, doubtful. North Korean tanks absorbed the hits, side and rear, at point-blank range. 3 days later, Colonel Robert R. Martin, commanding the 34th Infantry, killed, working a 2.36-inch launcher himself, trying to stop the tanks getting through. Then the ordnance reports arrived. Explained part of it. The old warheads were failing to detonate. Traced to years in humid and salt air, they had rotted. Crates. The Army airlifted the 3.5-inch launchers from the mainland. They reached the fighting at Taijon, and on July 20th, 1950, burned North Korean tanks in the city streets by the Busan perimeter. More than 900 were in theatre, 15 days. From Osan to Daejeon, and then came the winter, November 27th, 1950. The Chosin Reservoir, northeastern Korea, the 1st Marine Division, moving toward the Yalu River on the assumption that Chinese troops would not intervene. Chinese troops intervened. Roughly 12,000 Marines were in the forward area. Chinese forces were several times their size, in cold that ran to 30 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that freezes plasma solid before you can push it into a wounded man, the kind that makes rifle bolts weld shut. The road to the sea ran for 78 miles, through mountain passes, held now at every turn by Chinese infantry. The Marines fought their way down that road, and this time carried the 3.5-inch launcher, the M20. The one Ordnance had designed back in October of 1944, and then been told after the war not to distribute. To the theatre in July, manuals for it written at Fort Benning in 2 weeks flat, because there had not been any before at Chosin, in that cold. Dark, with hands that could barely close on a trigger. Marines used it against T-34s, against dug-in machine gun positions, against Chinese soldiers coming down the slopes in human waves under a moon so cold it looked blue. It worked, this time, not because anyone had improved it, but because someone had finally been allowed to build enough of them. The 1st Marine Division came out of Chosin carrying their dead, their wounded, and their weapons, down that 78-mile road, fighting the whole way. They saved themselves, which is the only accurate description of what happened there. And the tube, the one that had failed at Osan, the one that had rotted in warehouses for 5 years, was in their hands, in its correct size, doing the job it should have been doing all along. For those men, on that road, in that cold. The tube in their hands was at last the one the engineers had asked for. Just late. That is how fast it moved, once someone was paying attention again. And that is the whole thing. In 1944, it worked, because somebody never stopped checking it against reality. In 1950, it failed, because for 5 years, nobody had. The measurement was never a moment, it was a habit. Habits can be defunded. The design outlived everyone who touched it. The 3.5-inch launcher stayed in service through the 50s. Then Ordnance began the search for something a man could carry more easily. Use once, throw away, they called it the M72 Law. Light anti-armor weapon, telescoping fiberglass tube, 2.5 pounds. It went to Vietnam. Every American infantryman who served there saw one, then the 84, fire and forget, guided by a computer smart enough to pick the top of the tank. Plate is thinnest, and the crew sits, every one of them, descendants of a rocket in a length of tube, with the fire timed to end before the projectile cleared the front. The Panzerfaust, which Germany developed separately from the Panzerschreck, on a different principle, went its own way in Soviet hands, the RPG family, and every insurgency in every alley in every capital of the second half of the 20th century. There is not a single shoulder-fired anti-armor weapon anywhere in the world today. It does not owe something to that afternoon at Aberdeen. The rockets got smaller, the warheads got smarter, the tubes got lighter. The idea was the same idea. A boy in New Jersey, a captain in the basement, a Swiss engineer nobody wanted to pay, and a lawyer reading other people's paperwork. 4 men, 4 different rooms, in the same building, who might have gone their whole careers without meeting, for war had not come along and forced somebody to notice. Scrap Heap did not give America the bazooka. What gave America the bazooka? Program small enough that the man who knew the burn time, the same man walking past the junk, and poor enough that he had to look there. In the first place, Edward Uhl married Maureen Kelleher in 1943. He left the army a lieutenant colonel in 1947, went to work on rockets at Glenelg, Martin, became president of Fairchild in 1961, and retired as chairman in 1985. Among the aircraft built on his watch was the A-10 Thunderbolt II, designed from the nose back, around a gun, for killing tanks. The man who gave a rifleman a way to kill armor spent his second career giving a pilot one. He died in Maryland on May 9, 2010, at 92, late in life. In an interview he did not much want to give. He said what he thought he had learned in that two-man office. 1,942 American organizations, he reckoned, had fallen into a bad habit of heaping people onto projects into the trap of believing. 1,000 incompetents, properly organized, could do the work of a few dozen good ones. He said it as the retired chairman of a defense corporation. He had earned the standing and every commercial reason not to. Leslie Skinner, the captain in the basement, the boy who set fire to the hospital roof, retired a full colonel in 1947. He died in Clearwater, Florida, in November of 1978. 78 years old. Most of what he had built by then bore other men's names. Henry Mohaupt, the Swiss engineer no army wanted to pay, lived on, worked in Fort Worth after the war on the same technology applied to oil wells, died in 2001. Isidore Jackman rests in a Jewish cemetery in Dundalk, Maryland. His name is on an armory in Owings Mills and on a stone, Belgian village. That thanked him, before it knew what to call him. Go back to Aberdeen. One last time, May 1942, a tank crossing a field. Funded, scheduled, sanctioned weapons. Missing, and off to one side. On nobody's list, 2 men, a wooden stock, and a sight bent that morning, from a wire coat hanger, and a broken nail, found in the dirt. It hit if you have made it this far. It means you care about the details, not the legend, which is the whole point of doing this work. And if you take one thing from Izzy Jackman, from Leslie Skinner, from Edward Uhl, from the men who opened those crates in Tunisia with nothing but a printed sheet, and from the ones who fired 22 rounds into a T-34 at Osun and watched it drive on, let it be this. The record remembers weapons. A weapon is only an argument about what somebody bothered to notice. A tube is a tube, until a man measures it. Then it is the difference between a village burning and a village putting up a stone.